All right, well, everyone's quieted down, so I think I'll just get right into it. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. We have our distinct pleasure of hosting Debbie Epstein Henry today, who's an internationally recognized expert, consultant, and public speaker on the future of the legal profession, new legal models, women, and work-life balance. She's the author of Law and Reorder, the #1 best-selling ABA flagship book for 2011, and has co-authored a second book, Finding Bliss, Innovative Legal Models for Happy Clients and Happy Lawyers, which is also the title of today's talk. A former practicing litigator, Debbie is president and founder of Flex Time Lawyers LLC, which is a firm providing consulting, training, and speaking services for law firms, companies, and nonprofits in US, Canada, and Europe. Debbie is also a co-founder and managing director of Bliss Lawyers, a firm which is a new legal model operating administratively from a virtual platform with employees in a dozen or more states. How she manages to find the time to do all these things, I don't know, but we are very grateful and lucky to have her here today to talk to us about these issues. So please welcome Debbie.
So thank you so much, Hakeem, and to your other Harvard colleagues in the room, and of course the Harvard students. I'm so delighted to be here. I also want to acknowledge, in response to your comment of how I do some of these things, I actually am privileged to have two of my colleagues in the room. One of my co-authors of the book, Susie Scanlon-Rabinowitz, and Dan Rabinowitz, who is our CFO, and actually Bryce, who is hopefully a future student here as well. And so anyway, I'm really delighted to be here. We're a really small group, so I want to encourage you to ask questions, jump in. Let's make this conversational and fun. What I want to do is share some of the findings of the book and sort of where they originate, and then get questions and feedback from you. So everybody can hear me okay, I assume? Okay, all good. So I want to talk about changes in the legal profession and just give you a little context of how I got to these issues. Hakeem mentioned in my bio that an area of focus for me is work-life and women's issues. When I graduated law school, I clerked in the Eastern District of New York, then I practiced in New York, and then I joined a Philadelphia firm as a litigator. And in 1999, I was sort of miserable practicing. I had two kids at the time. I was trying to play an integral role in my kids' lives. I was also on this partnership track, and I really was at a loss. And I sent an email out in 1999 saying, I'm starting a brown bag lunch group for lawyers interested in work-life issues. The first event will be at my firm. Forward the invite to anyone who's interested. Within a couple days, 150 people emailed me back in response. And I knew I wasn't alone. There was clearly something going on in the profession around work-life issues. So I spent more than a decade then focusing on work-life issues. Many of them were surrounded by women's issues because at the time, really, most men weren't comfortable raising their hands, acknowledging that they too were worried about work-life issues and how to integrate their life. But through writing my first book and talking around work-life and women's issues in the profession, I really came to a big thought, which was, this isn't just about work-life issues, this isn't just about women's issues, this is about a broken legal model. And that's really what is the origin more of my remarks today. It's about this broken legal model and what's going on in the profession. So I want to touch on a couple of themes along these lines. Richard Susskind's a really brilliant futurist. You may have read or heard his name already. I'm going to mention a couple of themes that he talks about changes in the profession that are really impacting lawyers' success and happiness. One is around globalization. Work has become so much more competitive, and as a result, there's just so much more pressure on lawyers to perform given the global competition of the marketplace. Second is a trend around disaggregation, and that's a term really referring to work being parsed out much more. So historically, a law firm would take on a representation of, let's say, a matter, and they would represent that client from start to finish. Now work is much more disaggregated, meaning chunked out or broken out, and as a result, there's opportunities for all different types of legal service providers to take on part of a representation. The third trend is technology. Of course, you live and breathe this trend. You're the first generation really raised on technology. That is changing the way we work. And commoditization, a related term, which is really about how a lot of work that historically junior associates may have done is now being systematized. So those are sort of four trends that are in place in the marketplace. Another big trend, again, impacting lawyers' performance, satisfaction, daily lives, is really what are the expectations now being put upon lawyers by in-house legal departments. they're looking very differently at the way law should be practiced and the way legal services should be delivered. So they are getting pressure to shrink their budgets and shrink their headcounts, and as a result, they want from their law firm lawyers more predictability in fees and budgets. They are more sophisticated in terms of the work that they expect. They want value from their lawyers. They want flexibility and creativity, and they're not willing to pay for junior lawyer training. So that's putting a lot of pressure in the marketplace as well. So what's happening to law firm lawyers, and why has there been this sort of collision of dissatisfaction and a lot of pressure in the marketplace? First of all, there's just a question about whether there's a need for fewer lawyers. And by the way, you're all law students, I know, and so to have a slide up here that says there's potentially a need for fewer lawyers, I know that's not a good thing. And you've come to a talk with their cartwheel on the advertisement for the talk. I promise this is about the last depressing slide. I promise we're about to elevate the mood in a moment. But in terms of sort of how we got to these issues, a lot of the small and medium firms are kind of more focused on a niche market, and they haven't been as negatively impacted. But the traditional law firms are the ones who are really suffering. Fewer large law firms are doing what's called bespoke work, which is kind of the really high-level work. And the firms that are really doing the most elite work, that circle of firms is really shrinking. And so if you have bet the company work, meaning work that's done at a very high level, that's not price sensitive. You can, clients will still pay anything, but the next tier down, that level of work is really changing. And as a result, a lot of large firms that maybe you would have joined in the future, and maybe you will be joining, they're doing a different type of work. Some people say they're really going to be turning into more of a subcontractor type of role. So there's a lot of different shifts going on, and as a result, alternative legal vendors are really stepping in and taking over a lot of the work that may have historically been done by large law firms. So with all that stuff, sort of what is the answer? In my mind, the answer is about happiness. And I know that sounds really sort of like, are you naive and all that sort of stuff. It's not a luxury. And the reason why I really think happiness is not a luxury is the profession really needs to shift and focus on two things. One is how to deliver legal services better, and two, how to improve legal practice for lawyers. And the idea is really that when you have legal services being delivered in a better way, in other words, happy clients, and when you have lawyers who are more engaged in legal practice, in other words, happy lawyers, you have a higher functioning profession. And in this book, our new book, Finding Bliss, each chapter is introduced by a different thought leader. The concluding chapter is actually introduced by a woman named Gretchen Rubin, and some of you may know her name. She's a happiness expert. She's a New York Times best-selling author on happiness. And she introduces the concluding chapter of the book and says, happiness, in fact, is not a luxury. When you have people who are happy, and then they're more productive, more profitable, more engaged people, they're more loyal as employees, and so really that's the objective. So the question is really, how do we get there? And in the book, and in our research, what we found is there are 7 themes to gaining happy clients, happy law students, happy lawyers, and happy legal employers. And these, in our mind, are really the themes to gaining more happiness. Innovation, value, predictability and trust, flexibility, talent development, diversity and inclusion, and relationship building. These are the 7 themes. So how did we get here? And let me finish that story I'd started to tell before. So I mentioned that for over a decade, I started focusing on work life and women's issues. What then evolved is I did a book tour for my first book, and I talked to lawyers around the country. I also talked to clients and in-house legal departments around the country, and started hearing from these lawyers all over about really what they wanted in legal services. And what the clients were saying is they want more flexibility and control in terms of staffing. They want the luxury to bring in lawyers on high-level matters, and then when the work goes away, they want the flexibility to let go of those lawyers. They also said that we're sick of paying for those fancy offices that our law firms will bill us from, that we know we're paying for the artwork on the walls. So what these clients were saying is they wanted legal services delivered differently. Right around the time that I'm hearing these messages from these clients, I got a call from Susie and our third co-author of the book, this guy Gary, and they said, we've been running a virtual law firm for over a decade, And our clients keep on asking to borrow our lawyers. They keep on saying, can we borrow a lawyer from here or there? And we started dispatching our 19 lawyers at our virtual firm at various client sites. They said, we don't want to decline our lawyers because they'll go, we don't want to decline our clients, they'll go elsewhere, but at the same time, we need somebody to do our legal work. So they asked me if I could tap in with them and work with them so that I can give them people from our network and start dispatching lawyers from the network that I had developed to our various client sites. That's how we started what became a secondment firm, a firm of lending out lawyers. And through running this firm for now nearly 4 years, we've learned a tremendous amount about how to develop happy lawyers and happy clients through another legal model. So these 7 themes about how to deliver legal services differently came from building this alternative legal model together. But let me share with you that it's not that easy. And so I want to talk to you, among these 7 themes here, in our short time together, I can't talk to you about all these themes. So I want to focus on particularly the theme of innovation. And I want to talk to you about how to create happiness and satisfaction in the practice through innovation, give examples of innovation that are going on in the industry so that as you're going through your time here in law school and thinking about your career, you can think about how to be innovative. But before we get into innovation, I have to say that being trained as a lawyer sometimes is not exactly consistent with being an innovator, and I'll give you a couple examples. One is this notion of looking backwards. So in law school, we're all trained to look at precedent to determine our decisions, right? We're saying, okay, well, if we need to decide this new case, we've got to look backwards at how that case was decided under similar circumstances before. Well, it's not really great to be an innovator when you're looking backwards. So one of the things you need to do in sort of training your mind to be an innovative thinker as a law student and subsequently as a lawyer is to not just have that rear view mirror mentality. Another thing you want to think about, again, in law school, we're often trained to issue spot. And what is issue spotting? It's about getting a set of scenario and saying, okay, what are the problems here? Let me identify every single problem with this scenario. Again, that's not really the best thinking in terms of innovation and creativity and looking forward. So again, we need to really shift our lens and be thoughtful when we think about innovating as lawyers and law students. But there's another thing that we do as lawyers and law students that I think requires some reframing. And along those lines, I want to share a story about one of my kids and give you an idea of really what I want you to push through. So I have 3 sons, and my middle son, Spencer, was in kindergarten at the time, and he had this wonderful tradition in his kindergarten class where every day the teachers wrote a question of the day on the board, and you dropped off in the morning. At the end of the day, there was a list of all the students in the class and what their answer was to the question of the day. So one morning I drop off, and there was the question of the day, what does your mom do? And I was sort of excited about this. This is this school where he went to kindergarten. It was mostly dual parent career household. So like pretty much all the moms were working. And I was like, this is going to be interesting. So come about my day. At the end of the day, I go pick up Spence. And there it is on the board and listing all the kids in the class and Spence's name. It's alphabetized by first name. His name's at the bottom. And I go through the list of all these moms' careers. Pretty impressive group. Doctors, lawyers, authors, investment bankers, all these great things. And then at the bottom, there's Spence, and it just says next to his name, my mom makes my lunch. So here's Spence. This is his kindergarten class, and there he is. They're all thinking about their moms doing these amazing things. I thought I had talked to him often about my career, but apparently all he was thinking about are my sandwiches, which do happen to be quite good, but I was hoping that he'd think a little bit more that I'd contribute. So anyway, I was quite depressed when I heard this and I saw this on the board. I called my sister. I'm like, what am I doing wrong as a mother? Like, what do we do here? She said, no, in fact, you should be quite happy about Spence's response. He's actually happy that you're taking care of him, and he's seeing you in his relationship to what you do as a mother, and that's good enough. So you should be quite happy about that. So this all about me mentality, it is actually appropriate apparently for a kindergartner. It's not appropriate for lawyers. And we have this whole feeding thing. We've got a real problem with this in lawyering in general about this, like it's all about me thing. So have you heard of this expression in terms of law firm lawyers, you eat what you kill? Have you heard about that? It's about like you originate the business, you bring it in. So there's that whole thing. Have you also heard about like when you want to be a partner at a law firm, it's really about a pie eating contest. And then if you, the prize is more pie if you become a partner. Have you heard that? Anyway, we got to move past the whole feeding fixation. We have to move past the all about me phenomenon. We need to think about innovation differently. So I want to share with you some interesting innovations that are going on and have you think broadly, think beyond that rear view mirror mentality, think beyond the issue spotting, think beyond it's about me, and think about innovation in law. And I want to give you some examples along those lines. Some of the interesting things we've seen is alternative fee firms. These are law firms that are just getting founded entirely on the principle of not relying on billable hours. So they're looking at value differently. They're looking at the quality of the work, the efficiency, and the results achieved. That's how they're looking at valuing a matter as opposed to hours logged. And a lot of unhappiness in law firms is about being valued just on your hours logged. So the notion of being involved with an alternative fee firm where they're valuing a lawyer as well as a matter differently is something that's very appealing. Virtual firms are also really appealing. I mentioned that my two colleagues and co-authors are members of a virtual firm. The virtual firm really is actually doing traditional law firm work typically, but what they're doing is most of the lawyers are working from home. And so you have so much more flexibility and control in the way in which you work. And interestingly, when you look at work-life studies, as I have, what lawyers find is that as long as they have more control in the way in which they work, they rate their satisfaction considerably higher. So this notion of a virtual firm, also these lawyers can keep up to 85% of what they bill, as opposed to in a traditional law firm model, they're typically only keeping about 33% of what they bill. So the lawyers have more flexibility. The other advantage about a virtual firm is now in the age of technology, these firms actually can compete in terms of legal work at a much higher level because technology has really leveled the playing field. As long as they have a high-profile website that's sophisticated, they can project an image as well as having sophisticated lawyers that can really enable them to compete in a very exciting way. Other examples of innovation in the legal profession are around different types of legal models. So legal outsourcing is one thing. So that's when, historically, like document review, that kind of lower level work is going out often to countries like India and China and Israel. What's interesting is when these sorts of legal models developed, people were really saying that, okay, well, they're cheaper, but they're not really better. What's happened now is that these legal process outsourcing firms that are doing this low-level work in such high volume, they are better. They're not only cheaper, but because this is all they do, they are doing it at a much more impressive level and at much higher rate of accuracy than those big firms that used to do that work. Then you've got different legal support vendors that are really using technology to provide legal services differently. Again, these types of models are taking away business from the traditional law firm model. You also have legal form firms. So an example of that is like a LegalZoom. So somebody who maybe is a user of LegalZoom is maybe using it to draft a will. These are people who otherwise maybe not have access to legal services at all. So it's providing access to legal services and really improving things for the overall customer of legal services, and legal forms can actually exist at a higher level as well. And then access to information firms. One of the things that's going on, this you can see actually as a student, is there's many more forums for information sharings, where clients used to have to pay for all the information they received. Now are these online forums, like a company like a Legal On-Ramp, where people can commune and communicate with access to a lot of legal information. So that kind of innovation, again, is providing opportunities for both clients and individuals to get access to information and legal services in a really much different way. Then there's innovation in new legal models, also in the context of secondment firms. I mentioned this term before. Have you guys heard this term before? It's something that people often know or don't know. A secondment is actually a British term. It's basically a borrowed lawyer. And so there have been temporary lawyers that have been lent out to companies and law firms for years. But historically, they were very low-level lawyers. They weren't well-credentialed. They weren't well-compensated. They never had benefits. Now there's a secondment firm model where these are very high-level lawyers. These are lawyers who could get a job at these companies or high-level firms. They've been trained at schools like Harvard Law School, and they're working on high-level temporary engagements. They go in an engagement, They do the work, and when the work goes away, that lawyer goes away. Again, it's responsive to general counsel needs for more flexibility. And so that's another legal model out there. And then there are hybrids of these models. There's hybrid innovation. So there's like a secondment firm and a virtual firm, like the company Bliss Lawyers I mentioned that we run. There are fixed fee collaboration firms. These are firms that do collaborations with sort of prestigious old line law firms with new companies, and they do collaborations on fixed fees, meaning flat fees, not just paying by the billable hour. So these are different iterations of innovation that are going on. So the one other thing I want to touch on, and I imagine most of you will initially at your jobs right out of law school be going to large law firms. And just curious, by a show of hands, for those of you who know where you're going for your first summer job, do you know if are you going to a large law firm, by a show of hands? And also by a show of hands, how many of you are first years? And how about second years? Okay, and then the rest are third years? Is that right? Okay, interesting. So most of you are going to large law firms, and I should definitely underscore that actually my co-founders and co-authors of this book, we all started at Big Law, and this is actually very much complementary of the things to think about with Big Law. So a lot of these ideas are sort of, you're going to your first job, but also about how you can be thoughtful about your next job, and really how can you be more critical in thinking about how you want to direct your career. So there's innovation going on in traditional law firms as well, and we're really seeing it in 4 respects. The first is alternative fees. I mentioned this before. So at some of the firms, up to 35% of how they bill their clients is through an alternative fee. So not relying on the billable hour model, but figuring out that sort of balance of quality of work, efficiency, and results achieved, how to measure that value in a means other than billable hours. So that's one alternative that's going on that's sort of innovative in law firms. Another one is re-engineering the use of space. This is something that I think a lot of the innovation in traditional law firms is really feeding on the new legal models. So you've got new legal models out there that are competing, that are virtual models, and now large law firms are saying, how do we compete with that? Well, one way is we have to re-engineer our space. So most often what large firms are doing is they're looking at they're creating more communal spaces, so they're actually housing more lawyers, but they're redesigning the space so it's more of like a Starbucks feel or a hospitality type of feel. They're creating much more desirable eating spaces, and so it's not only helping in terms of maximizing space, but it's also creating much more sense of community. I was walking around the law school before my talk today with one of your alums, and he was saying that when he was here, there weren't these kinds of communal spaces. They didn't have congregating areas where students could study together or sit by the fire and things like that. There's so much more of an emphasis on creating a community and an environment that supports that, and so that's very much what's going on behind these re-engineering of space issues. They're also trying to bring in more light to these spaces, again, knowing that the external environment very much impacts the performance of people, the happiness, the engagement of people, the community, all those things. Another thing that's going on in terms of innovation in law firms is reinventing and rethinking the way the talent pool is functioning. And this is something that we push in the book, and really something we're really trying to, I feel in my conversations with law firm leaders on a regular basis, that I really want to encourage them to think differently about the talent pool. So in large law firms, there's always been that brass ring to equity partner, but the question is, can we value other alternative paths to thriving as a lawyer at these firms? And if we did that, wouldn't we be more effective at retaining diverse talent, retaining Gen Y lawyers, retaining women, those who have historically resisted more of the rigid track? So there's a lot of fiddling with that model. Some law firms are looking to use non-lawyer professionals for more of the work that clients are pressuring them to do at a reduced level. Some are bringing in temporary lawyers more. Some are trying to experiment with alternative valued tracks to success at the firm beyond just the equity partner track. The last type of innovation that we're seeing is a reconfiguration of the categorizing of information. So what we're seeing is some of the large firms really trying to help their clients digest and tackle managing this data, which is so overwhelming to them. So different types of e-data practices are cropping up. So that's kind of a survey of what we're seeing. And I think the real message around innovation in terms of when we speak to audiences like this, or just otherwise when we're observing it in the profession, is this quote from Charles Darwin. And it is that It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that is most adaptable to change. That to us, and actually it's an opening quote in the book, is really what the message is here, is that we really need to be thoughtful about change and how to embrace it. And to do that, to be thoughtful about what the changes are that are going on around you, and in turn, how will you be most happy and successful in performing in that transition and period of change. So I want to pause, throwing a lot of different ideas at you, and I have some further thoughts I want to share, but I want to see if there are any questions and see if we can address some thoughts on your mind, why you came here today, what you're hoping to hear, those kinds of things. I do know a few names in the audience. Yes?
Thank you for coming. That was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
I was curious about tips for junior associates. I am going to one of the newer law firms. And it gives practical tips in terms of what we as juniors, especially first, second years, we don't have much control over pretty much anything.
It's good to know that, yeah.
That we can do, in a practical level to, I guess, effectuate some of the things. I know we don't have control over most of them, but what would be in our control?
So one of the things, actually, and I talk about this a lot in my first book and have spoken to a lot of law school campuses on this subject. I think that what's changed a lot in legal practice is that there's a premise that you're good. And that's sort of the threshold issue, that you need to be good. And the real question for law students and those entering the profession is, what are the differentiators between those lawyers who really thrive and those who really wither beyond doing good legal work? And I think there are 5 principal areas that from the outset, you as junior lawyers should be thinking about in terms of making your mark. And they're very much focused on developing yourself as a full and complete practicing lawyer. Historically, senior lawyers would really bring along junior lawyers on the way and sort of mentor them and show them the ranks. And there's less of that going on, so the onus is more on you. So what are those 5 areas that I think you can really focus on from the start? Number 1 is trying to develop and create leadership opportunities for yourself and executive presence. And what I mean by that is really raising your hand for leadership opportunities. And you think, oh, I'm a junior person, where can I really contribute? There are, non-billable roles that you can play at your firm from the outset where you can be a leader. There are roles that you can play at your bar association, in your community. But getting leadership exposure and experience from day one can really enhance your profile. Second is around the notion of sponsorship, which is about developing strategic alliances. So there's a lot of emphasis on mentoring. Mentoring is different from sponsorship. Sponsorship's really about identifying people who are powerful in the organization you're joining and seeing how you can bring value to them so that you can really get somebody to back you. So again, it's not just about the work, it's about getting people to support you. You can say, oh, this is a really good opportunity for him, or I think she would really be great for this kind of thing, and having powerful people looking out for you. The third is around effective networking. And again, I think that as a junior person, you're like, I'm not going to really be focused on that. But networking is way beyond just trying to think one day maybe as a lawyer at a law firm you'll develop business. Networking is really from day one about developing relationships, being a resource to people, being generous, being passionate about what you do and offering it to somebody else, and hoping one day that they'll be thoughtful about you as well. So that's third. Fourth is about navigating work-life and flexibility issues. So a lot of being successful professionally is about managing your time, managing your responsibilities outside of work, being able to thrive outside of work as well as inside of work. So having that balance in your life and being able to get satisfaction in both venues is key. And then the fifth is about effective self-promotion, actually. So I think that self-promotion is somewhat of a dirty word, and people feel like, I don't want to be one of those obnoxious people who self-promote. But being able to take credit where credit is due and really convey your value is critical to your success, because if you're a member of a team and you can't convey what you're bringing to the table, you're not going to be invited to that team next time. So being thoughtful on day one of those 5 things, I call it blueprinting for success, to me is really positioning graduating students and junior lawyers for success. And to be thoughtful about that on day one, I think can really position you for success. Other questions?
Can you talk a little bit more about the talent pool that you envision?
Right. What I think is so different is that, as I talked about, you have everybody going for, particularly in law firm context, the brass ring of equity partner, and the vast majority of people never achieve it. And so you've got the vast majority of the law firm population basically feeling like failures because they didn't reach the pinnacle. And so I think the future of legal practice is much more about a more forgiving and less linear path. So it's understanding that the natural course of life is that lawyers are going to go through transitions and be able to ramp up in their career sometimes and ramp down. So you've got, let's say, women lawyers. 30% of women lawyers leave the profession independent of maternity leave. So you have a third of the female talent pool working some non-linear path. I think that trend is much more predictable of how the future of practice will be for everybody, because Gen Y is pushing these issues that women historically pushed in a much more gender-neutral way and reason-neutral way, meaning it's not just about parenting. Gen Y is really pushing this agenda across industry, not just in law, about wanting to live an integrated life, not just valuing career and money, wanting to play an integral role in their community, wanting to travel, all these different things. So I think the future of the profession is going to hopefully be much more forgiving and much more of a varied path, and not one where there's an expectation that you're just going to stick yourself on this law firm path, let's say, and get that gold watch after 40 years. It's not the way of the marketplace anymore. Yes?
I have a follow-up question. I mean, the last 15 years we have seen women, especially changing profession more likely than men.
Right.
So how do you think that it's going to influence the future of the legal profession as that may increase as men may join the female pool in changing?
Right. I mean, what I hope it's hard. It's hard to predict. Nobody obviously has the crystal ball, but I think what another aspect of this same question that you're posing is that the models in which lawyers work are going to expand. So it was a fairly narrow selection of paths when I was graduating law school in 1994. You're either going to go law firm, you're going to eventually maybe go to in-house, but typically you couldn't go there straight out of law school, or maybe you're going to go this government or nonprofit route. I mean, it's fairly limited. And actually a few more slides from here, I'm going to show there's a much broader spectrum where lawyers will use their future degree, but still in some legal capacity. So now there are plenty of lawyers who are working in business and working in politics and all those things, but there are actually not that many opportunities historically of where lawyers could go where they'd still actually be using their legal degree. And I think that range of places where lawyers can work can really change, and that too will impact the talent pool. It's a question behind you. Yes?
So one of the things that struck me is, as we talk about innovation in the form of remote working, it's also in some ways introducing a new challenge, which is that you're available all the time and therefore have the ability to be working at times when historically you couldn't work if you weren't at the office. I'm thinking about like on vacation as an example.
Right.
I know that in the management consulting space, firms like the Boston Consulting Group, which are not, where their associates are not on the billable hour, have introduced things like PTO, protected time off, to try and balance that. I'm curious if you're seeing innovations like that in the legal space, and just what your general view is on how to balance the tension between the flexibility that's introduced by remote working and the challenge of being available at all times.
And I'm aware of that. Leslie Perlow, your Harvard Business School professor, I've collaborated with her and I know about her work in that consulting capacity. I think it's really great work. Unfortunately, I think, in the traditional law firm model, there really hasn't been progress in that regard. I think the luxury from the work-life standpoint, actually, of the billable hour is that the firm generates the same revenue wherever you bill. So what's great about that is actually the firm should be completely supportive of at least flexibility in where you work, because there's no impact on the revenue model. But still, there's very much the sort of macho FaceTime thing going on that prohibits people from really feeling free to work, at their leisure in terms of where they work. And that notion of really getting time off, just kind of stopping the clock, is really hard. And I think the issue you raise around flexibility and sort of being available all the time is a real issue. In my work, again, in my first book, I've really pushed the notion of the job share and say, if the job share is basically been embraced by the medical profession, where you have two doctors who are in the same practice who just step into each other's shoes. And you think that if doctors have accepted this and the public has said it's okay for doctors to step into each other's shoes when managing patients' lives, I think it's high time that we as lawyers can say, yes, we can step into each other's shoes in managing clients' legal problems, but I haven't had that much success with the law firms on that. So I think that while it can very much be done from a logistics standpoint, and clients would not even have to be charged anything extra, the lawyers themselves could absorb the transition cost of being able to hand over information. In traditional law firms, it's not really happening. That being said, in a virtual law firm model, like my friends, my colleagues who work in a virtual model, they're regularly doing that. In fact, Susie, her sister works in the same law firm, and they literally step into each other's shoes. So on an informal basis or in a non-traditional model, it's happening much more frequently. Unfortunately, in the traditional model, not so much. I want to throw a few more ideas out to you and then hopefully leave a little more time left for questions. But I just want to talk to you a little bit about innovation and talent development, because a number of the questions that you're raising pertain to this as well. So another really significant issue that I think is particularly apropos for this population is what I call junior lawyer fallout. Really what's happened, particularly in the downturn since 2008, is that clients have said, you know what, we no longer can afford to absorb the training costs of junior lawyers. You can't, as law firms, pass on those fees to us, those expensive fees of junior lawyers. And law firms say, well, we can absorb that cost in and of ourselves. And then law schools are saying, well, you know what, we don't really, while we're giving you more practical skills training, we're not really the ones equipped to do this training. So it's really somewhat of a crisis. And so I really am pushing innovation in the legal training model. I know there's been a lot of interesting discussion about this, about making the third year more practical skills based. One recommendation that we would make in the book is saying, why don't we outsource junior training? And the thought behind this is that outsourcing is the trend of the future across industry. Everybody's outsourcing. Why don't we do this in the legal context? And the example that we provide is, rather than, let's say, all the big law firms that you're going to, let's say you're going to these big law firms in New York, rather than each of your law firms train you as a first year on how to develop certain core competency skills that you need as, let's say, a junior litigator, let's say. What if the large firms in New York all formed a consortium and then outsourced this function to a very competent third party, and they did concentrated core competencies training for all of you? And then you went back to your law firms, and at a fraction of the cost, that law firm would then say, but we need to make sure you do it the Cravath way, and we'll tailor it and give you a few more special ways that Cravath does that. But the idea of outsourcing this function is something we're really pushing, and the idea is really, let's not risk not training our junior lawyers, because that risk is too great. So if we can figure out another way to do that in a much more cost-effective way, it's an exciting opportunity. You mentioned, and there were a few questions around talent and sort of roles, and I just wanted to throw out here a couple other recommendations. This, again, is from Richard Susskind, who I mentioned is this talented futurist who I cite too. Innovation in career design, this is when we talk about, oh, well, there may not be as many opportunities for lawyers. It may not be that these lawyers have opportunities to practice in the traditional ways that maybe I did when I graduated, but there are many more potential career roles for lawyers that could be an amalgamation of the lawyer hat and maybe an IT hat or some other hat. So some of the things he mentions here are like roles like the legal knowledge engineer, the legal technologist, or legal hybrid, or legal process analyst, these types of things, legal risk manager. The reason why I mention them again, most of you will be going to traditional law firms, but let's say you came to law school already with a background in, IP, and you had a technology degree undergrad in some capacity. Be thoughtful about, is there something I can be doing while I'm at this traditional firm? Can I be in the IP practice group? And maybe at some point I'll join a company and be on, take on a legal engineering type of role. Being thoughtful about sort of what the scope is and what the potential roles lawyers may play in the future of legal practice can be really helpful in scripting your career. Along these same lines, there's some really interesting innovation in employment venues. So not, again, just thinking, okay, I'm going to stay at the traditional law firm forever. Maybe you will, and maybe you will be one of those select people who gets that brass ring, and maybe you want it, and if you do, terrific. But if you don't, it's really helpful to know there are many more venues that lawyers are beginning to practice in. So what are some of these venues? Global accounting firms, major legal publishers, legal know-how providers, legal process outsourcers. There's all these different roles enumerated here. New look type of law firms, meaning alternative legal firms, or different types of legal service providers, so like a company like the one we co-own. So the idea of legal management consultancies, and I know some of the Harvard Law grads go to places like McKinsey, but thinking more broadly, and certainly many of your classmates will be going to different business roles, ultimately private equity firms and things like that, but actually thinking about playing some sort of legal role in a lot of these different types of venues, again, can be very broadening and inspiring to you, because if you are at various points in your career where you're working in a certain employment venue that isn't really exciting you, to be thinking about, okay, well, these are opportunities that may exist out there for some of my colleagues. What steps can I be taking now in addition to the ones I enumerated before that can position me to maybe be attractive to an accounting firm one day, things like that. So really the objective here is, again, to think about how can we improve client service? How can we do that better? How can we improve legal practice, so lawyers getting more satisfaction about their daily lives? And the end result is really about more profitability, increased productivity, and increased satisfaction. And really having that as a real aspiration and as a real goal, and not thinking of the notion of Bliss lawyers as an oxymoron, is something I really challenge you to think about. And I think now is really the time, as you're a law student, to be thinking about how you're framing your career and make that part of the profile of things that you are entertaining, and along with prestige of employer or compensation or all those other factors. So along those lines, I want to share another personal story, and this one again is about Spencer, and my colleagues have heard this before, so hopefully you'll indulge me. But Spence at the time was actually 5 and the middle of 3 boys, and constantly negotiating with me to get a dog, and very, very persuasive. He's my future lawyer, and he's saying, we can definitely do this, and all these things. And I said, Spence, we've had this conversation before. I can't do it. With 3 boys and 7 under, and me and Dad working, it'll push me over the edge. And he said, well, I have a solution. We could trade in Theo, who's my 2-year-old in the picture, for the dog. And so I think this is very apropos of law students and lawyers and legal practice. And the reason why I share this story is, as law students, I mentioned some other things you were learning in the beginning, looking back at precedent to determine the future, issue spotting. But another really great skill you're learning in law school, and what you'll continue to cultivate as lawyers, is how to be a creative thinker, an artful negotiator, and a zealous advocate. And while those are skills that you're often cultivating as a lawyer and trying to think about the best way to represent your clients, we seldom think about that in terms of ourselves. So it's critical that you apply that reasoning to yourself. And as you're evaluating what are the right career choices for you and how you can deliver legal services better, you want to think about that creativity and that artful negotiating as it applies to you and your own career. The other thing I'll say is that you're not working in a vacuum. And so as you're thinking about how to design that career that works for you, you also want to make sure it's a win-win for you and your prospective employer or your existing employer. So in our family, for example, this was Spencer's family portrait here. Once he realized he wasn't getting rid of Theo, it was like, we're going to make Theo as tiny as possible. And so that's actually not what you're aspiring to. You're designing a win-win, so it's more like this family portrait where he's actually part of the picture here. So you want to design that win-win. You want to figure out a way how you can perform, have that creativity, have that excitement and satisfaction in your career, but also make sure it's a win-win for the family, or in your case, for your legal employer as well. So with that, I want to take some more questions. We have, I know, at least 5 minutes, and hear what you have to say. Yes?
Yeah, have you applied your thinking to the public sector, to the NGO community, to the government sector, the state, federal, or local levels?
So it's interesting. Our book is mostly on the private sector because that's been largely the experience of the 3 co-authors in the book. I personally have worked in government, and I clerked for 2 years out of law school, and then otherwise have worked in my consulting capacity with different nonprofit organizations, actually abroad as well as in the US. And I think these issues are very much at play. I think that particularly like the 5 factors that I mentioned in response to your question around blueprinting, I've done that concept and that programming at The Hague, and it resonates just as much there as it does, at U.S. law firms and in-house legal departments. So I think that the examples that are provided here are in the private sector, but the relevancy, I think, is across the board, and it's tweaking things. So like in the context of law firms, for example, you're talking about networking and business development. In the nonprofit sector, you're not talking about business development as much, but you know what? There's philanthropy, which is very much on that sort of subject. So I think they're relatable, but again, the examples that we provide are mostly in the private sector. Yes?
I was thinking more about the billable hour pressure,
Yeah.
because you don't have billable hours
Right.
in the other sectors, and yet the pressure to work very long, very hard hours is omnipresent.
Right.
And I wonder to what extent it's really not a function of law firms, but our society at this point.
Right. I think that this notion of 24/7 availability is part of our society, and I think where you see that being such an issue is that it's not just happening in the work world, it's happening in our private lives, so that there's this expectation of doing everything and being at every soccer game and baking everything. And I mean, just the demands have escalated to such a high level in every venue, and so I think that's very much the case. I think, where the example is more acute, at least in law firms, is that you have this measure of the billable hour that's, it's not measuring value, it's not measuring quality of work, it's not measuring efficiency, actually quite the opposite, and yet it's this anchor of that's determining people's, success in terms of, whether they're promoted and all these things. So it's that particularly acute. But absolutely, I agree. I mean, I think this issue around 24/7 availability and the demands that are placed on individuals are so enormous now that it has contributed to much of the depression and things that are reported that lawyers are facing and other professionals across industry. Yes?
I wonder, are you telling a story of happiness, or are you telling a story of the market?
It's interesting. It's funny. The book came out in January, and I started doing a book tour in January. And what I'm facing, in honest truth, is that a lot of times people are showing up to the talk, and they just see the subtitle, the main title of the book, Finding Bliss, and they expect to come in and say, tell me how to be happy in the next hour talk. And the book, the subtitle of the book, is actually much more exemplary of the content of the book, which is Innovative Legal Models for Happy Clients and Happy Lawyers. It's saying, let's, through innovation, talk about how to deliver legal services better and how to deliver happier lawyers. And so it's really more of a broader question of the legal marketplace. It's not just talking about...
What I mean by that is, are these changes aren't being driven by law firms or these innovative models simply wanting people to be happier.
Absolutely not.
They're driven by the fact that they want to get cheaper.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's not about the bottom line being happiness. The point of our message is that actually when you provide more value, when you are more efficient, when you make clients happier, you actually in turn also make lawyers happier, that the two are connected. But this is not a book or a message that's saying, just be happier and make lawyers happy. It's directly linking it to the business case, because we know our audience, and we know that law firm management or general counsel are not going to do this just for the sake of having a happier profession. That's why I mentioned earlier on Gretchen Rubin's introduction, the conclusion of the book, where she says the research supports that actually when you have happier employees, they're more productive, more profitable, more loyal to their employers. Other questions? Really? Any comments from my colleagues in the back?
Well, I can't help myself, since you asked. I guess I would have one piece of advice for anybody in this room who's going to go to a law firm. That's the piece of advice that nobody gave me that I wish they had. and that is when you're working, leave your office. It is really hard to leave your office when you're a new associate. And you will get invitations for lunch, you will get invitations for CLE, for cocktail events and outings. And I just think it's so valuable to leave your office and build relationships while you're in your firm.
Great point. Just question, in entering and deciding to come to this talk today, if one or more of you would share really what was prevailing on your mind in doing that, sort of what answer in particular that you have on your mind that you want addressed, either anxiety about doing something in entering your careers and practice or things like that. Anybody want to throw out any ideas? Don't be shy. I did a talk on the book earlier this month, which Hakeem listened in on. It was webcasted. And one of the questions was really about, junior lawyers and law students and sort of what's prevailing on their minds. And I just added in the webcast, which Hakeem heard, is that I said one of the problems is these ideas about lawyer satisfaction while they're engaged in practice, these are really taboo subjects. And I said, in fact, I got the invitation that we had prepared for this event, and Hakeem sent it to me, and there's this picture of somebody doing a cartwheel, on the invitation for this event. And I said, I have to say, I would hazard a guess that this is the first cartwheel invitation that was ever circulated on Harvard's campus, and we need to see more cartwheeled invitations on Harvard and other law school campuses. So I want to applaud you for coming today, because I think these are really important issues that you should be thinking about. And unfortunately, they haven't been as valued in our profession, but we're testaments to say that there are happy lawyers out there who have charted their own paths, and some of us again have stayed in traditional practice. In our case, with my two co-authors and myself, we didn't. We started there, but we created other opportunities. But whichever path you end up taking, or someplace in between, what's important is that you go into the profession, particularly graduating from a school like this, knowing that you have real options, and to have this as part of your priority, to be able to know that you can be satisfied and engaged in work and excited about the work that you're doing and feeling like you're contributing in a meaningful way. Those are very legitimate aspirations. So with that, I really want to thank you for listening, and thank you again for having me, and encourage you to get in touch if you want to talk more or stay after for questions. Thank you again.